Thank you so much for including us. This is work with Xi Ying Lim at National University of Singapore. Of course, now is a Chinese New Year, so she's not able to join us. This is a theory paper, and again, it's really built on a number of existing case studies in the literature, particularly in the information systems field. So both Xi Ying and myself, we are in information systems. And it's really trying to focus on the technology development aspects that particularly have been missing in digital entrepreneurship literature in my field, and hopefully that focus has relevance to this community. Somehow all right. Okay, so this is all about kind of software digital companies. And so digital ventures is when really the critical infrastructure, the engine of the company is very much tied into digital resources. And again, the IS community has particularly tried to be complementing some of the entrepreneurship literature in this particular space. This also is trying to theorize in the nascent early stage of these ventures. And from the IS perspective, when we look at the entrepreneurship literature, we see a lot of focus on the entrepreneurial activity and again, how to deal with this uncertainty. And the information systems community has tried to provide a complementary perspective, particularly looking at the digital artifacts, a lot about the attributes, how they are creating a much less bounded environment. So much talk about this boundaryless. And then rather than focus on the entrepreneurial action, really looking at these kind of what's called the objective actor independent factors. So in this theory paper, and again, this is still work in progress, so not yet submitted anywhere. We are trying to be bringing these two tracks together. Right? So our premise really is again coming from the IS, where it has all been about network effects, all about scaling and scaling fast. That even those ventures, and we are talking about largely software related ventures, they still have to worry about other things than scaling or growth. And so again, revenue matters. We just heard about quite a bit about profitability, with growth, but also legitimate identity. And so in this space, those are three ends that should be within the entrepreneurial horizon or the vision, so to speak. And here's just a whole bunch of citations. Again, from IS literature that kind of speaks to that, that it's not just about scaling. So our research question is, again, about these digital resources, but not just looking at the attributes of the digital resources and how they create scale effects, but really, taking those attributes and what is it that the entrepreneurs do with them. So really looking at the resources in use. So kind of bringing that agency perspective along with these digital artifacts, and with the view that again need to be whether we call it the balancing or blending, and of course these are not equally important at any particular time, but think about the the growth, the revenue, and the identity. So our backdrop is the resourcing theory from organization sciences, And of course, Feldman, Warline, a number of other scholars have contributed to this. The roots of resourcing is very much in social practice theory. And so obviously in ventures, we need both social and digital. Again, this is really theorizing about the development of these digital resources, the development approaches. And so from the resourcing perspective, we get the schema, kind of the vision, the cognitive actions that I will speak about. And then of course, the action that has been driven by the schema, creates new resources and shapes the schema. So what we are really adding is trying to bring the technology development actions to the game. So again, what does this all really mean in terms of agile, other iterative development that we would kind of consider, the lean method, the design thinking, and then acceptation. And of course, we could kind of add, other approaches here as well. All right. So a key element, is really about the ampliative cycles. So that's kind of the core, really the heart of the resourcing theory, the way that we see it. And much of the discussion so far, at least the literature that we have been reading in resources, is about these positive ampliative cycles. And so our argument is that unless, again, there is some consideration of not just growth, revenue or funding, but also identity, it's, there might be, what we could call the, negative ampliative cycles. So again, not in the interest of the firm, particularly in terms of, survival. Right. So again, schema comes from, resourcing. And so, we are just reinterpreting that to be specifically in this context about the beliefs about technology. And then beliefs about the entrepreneurial ends. And these are very much obviously, reinforcing each other. Violina has this great paper on Google versus Yahoo. Of course, the paper itself is about the partnerships, but you learn a lot about the technology beliefs also, and how some of those beliefs, had impact in terms of the growth, but also revenue. So Yahoo specifically, was basically just, acquiring a lot of technological assets, not really modifying them, not building internal capabilities, getting lots of growth really fast, but then it's uneven, uneven revenues. And of course, there were also, some issues in terms of the identity over the long term. All right. And so another, a great paper, Kirtley and O'Mahony, they talk about again, a pivot very much involves kind of a shift, kind of fundamental shift in the technology beliefs. And of course, there are a lot of schema changes that are not necessarily pivots. And so these technology beliefs, don't need to change fundamentally, but can be still very important in terms of the entrepreneurial ends. All right. So kind of getting into what's really important for technology development from the resourcing theory, and ties to the amplitude. How do we kind of keep this cycle moving? It really kind of gets into these cognitive mechanisms that we are borrowing from Feldman's work. So one is mutual adjustment, right? So again, we see a paper about web services, and again, how experimentation and this iterative development was very much used to target the product to a particular customer, and that was good for revenue in that respect. But the schema itself, didn't change in terms of the mutual adjustment. Just the position, is a cognitive mechanism that assumes that there is a change in the schema. And so important to kind of create this liminality space that allows to minimize these differences between the old and the new. So we don't get caught up in the path dependencies, the existing constraints. And so again, this juncture positioning would be important to bring, for example, into the iterative development so that it creates new possibilities over time. And this kind of again comes back to some of the things we just heard about repertoire. How do we think about these technology development methodologies and how they are embedding these cognitive mechanisms? So our point is that again the different technology methodologies are emphasizing one or more of these, and oftentimes in practice they get just limited in terms of the cognitive mechanisms. And then last mechanism from the resources is this narratives, and so kind of sense making. How does the firm make sense over time of its actions? And this, of course, is very important in terms of identity, identity building, and again, being able to work with the partners, maintaining credibility, with the having credibility with the venture, and so we would kind of argue that in many cases the ventures get very focused on mutual assessment as they try to please certain customers. So revenue is good, but forgetting about the growth and maybe identity also gets too narrowly focused. Just a position great in terms of growth and new opportunities, but can create again perhaps weak identity, and we might be trying to do too many things and particularly really hurting the profitability. Right. And so our story is really in terms of the design principles is how in practice to make sure that the design teams are really, if they are doing agile, right, creating these kind of spaces to really reflect and think about, should we be doing, some, just the positioning, creating new opportunities, so we don't get, too, honing ourselves to a narrow hole, for example. And then, of course, the narratives, revisiting the identity. And acceptation, we kind of associate in primarily as a, just a positioning, looking at what exists and can we do something new, in a new market with a new product idea. But again, what is really important, particularly in these businesses, is to build these internal capabilities, particularly in terms of the technology and the technology architecture. So it's not just about volume. You need to build this really robust architecture that you can build on then and go into potentially to different markets with different products. And I don't really have a lot of time to flesh this out, but there's a case, great case that some of my colleagues in IS wrote on Vcash, and it's really helps to understand how this firm in 8 months, so 8 months went from 0 customer to 600,000 customers. It's packaged as a scaling story. But if you really read that, it's a very rich article, but if you read it, it says a lot about identity and how they had to be continuously reflecting on the identity. And it's silent on the revenue side, but it was a spin-off of a large firm. So we assume that some of the funding came initially from the parent, and then over time with some of the partners like the mobile operators that they teamed up. But what is really critical is that it wasn't just about the growth, but really managing these three different entrepreneurial ends. And we also see in the story how there is trial and error, which is much more of an exploratory, what again we might associate with acceptation, and then kind of this experimentation that is much more of the lean startup, also kind of iterative, when you kind of already understand what your kind of problem is. You're just trying to really find the most efficient solution. And then again, this over time, the narrating to update the identity. And so
just a quick question.
yes,
Is this the last slide?
Yes, so really the story is that we are trying with these mechanisms to bring bring this the entrepreneurial ends and the technology development approaches, and arguing that particularly as we think about the software ventures, it's not just about the artifacts, but really how they are produced, the actions that matters, and we need these reflection spaces. So basically slow time. So we can go really fast, but then need these moments of reflection. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. So we have a bunch of questions here, and I was under the impression, the mistaken impression, that you actually had data when I saw the presentation, that this was an empirical paper partly, but you draw on lots of other papers to make the more conceptual case. So I'm really happy for this concluding that was supposed to be an empirical kind of module, that Kathy actually stepped in and presented 3 empirical papers. So we kind of made up for that, my little mistake there. So I think Saras, if you want to ask your question about resourcing first.
Yeah, I think mine is kind of a dumb basic question, which is you're talking about digital resourcing a lot, and I'm just wondering in what way is that different from resourcing generally? Like, what is the I know that there are specific things in your model that are refining and adding to Martha Feldman's work, but I'm just wondering, why is everything that you're saying not applicable to all kinds of resourcing? Why is it about digital resourcing, do you think?
Thank you for that question. So the way that we have been reading the resourcing theory is that it really focuses the actions. So, basically, again, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but basically resource is what you kind of make of it. All right. And we kind of at the end, and I didn't really have time to elaborate, is that digital resources have have attributes that aren't present. And so, for example, Kirtley and Omar Homi, for example, they are looking at some hardware-related, hardware-related startups. So it's very difficult to do irreversibility because you have certain commitments. So with digital resources, they tend to be much less of a cost to undo a commitment, for example. So that would be one example. And this kind of means that resourcing that is all about these actions haven't paid attention to attributes, but in digital resourcing, we do need to bring the attributes because they allow particularly these ampliative cycles to go much faster and much broader than what we would expect, for example, businesses with physical, assets as primarily. Does that answer your question?
I don't want to belabor the point. I'm not asking generally what's the difference. I'm looking at your model, your theoretical framework, and I'm thinking we can apply it to other kinds of resourcing too. That's the way I'm not asking in general what's the difference.
Yes. And I think again, could be just my limited reading, but again, the resourcing, oftentimes it has just kind of looked at, for example, issue selling, a certain particular end. And what we are really saying in terms of these entrepreneurial ventures is that there's a lot of multiple dimensions that need to be viewed. And, in the previous presentation, we certainly heard about its growth and its profitability, and kind of adding, well, it's also identity. And it's not easy to manage these three things simultaneously, particularly with digital assets where, again, you have very open space, and particularly like communities can take you simultaneously to a lot of different, in different directions, and hurt your identity.
So it's the multiple ends part of it. Okay.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
Stefan, your question is kind of partly addressed here, but do you want to elaborate? No. Okay, then Susan, you had a question about narratives and the role of narratives as knowledge stores.
Sure. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it and appreciate it. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the role of narratives? It seemed to be, hanging on the end, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you see narratives being used in this process. Are they updating with information, or are they creating information? So can you elaborate a little bit more on the role of narratives?
Yes. So again, we see, for at least, looking at the IS literature in this space, that the identity is ignored, and because of this lack of focus on it, it actually creates these negative ampliative, cycles. So for example, there's a great story of a blockchain a platform, and well, no, I'm sorry. It was it's a case on a crowdfunding platform. So this is a startup of a crowdfunding platform, and they can try to grow very fast. And so, their vision was really become, attractive, to the professional investor. But the actions that they took appealed to the non-professional investor. So, for example, some of the things that they were highlighting, as they try to manage is, how can we make this site as easy to use as buying a handbag? And so they didn't at all really think about, again, what would be important in terms of legitimate identity with these professional customer groups, and so it's really about what was the narrative that they were using inside the company and with their partners as they were building this identity. And so again, their spiel was a lot about how this is the easiest to use a platform. I don't know, am I answering the question? So it's really, narrative is the sense-making a mechanism that the organization is using, in some sense, how the executives themselves are making sense out of it, and then how they are presenting this sense-making, to the, external partners, customers, etc.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like you envision the narratives as reflecting what the firm knows, and as the firm updates its
Yes, but for example, like the
narrative
Papa
reflects
car,
these updates.
that's right. But again, in our analysis, again, the research papers we have looked at on BlaBlaCar. So, for example, there were some mishaps in terms of how the identity, was being managed. Also, again, they kind of tried to move in two different directions. Didn't again have the necessary funding and revenue. Then had to kind of back from that. And in some sense, the identity building was quite reflective. I would say following the rest of the actions. Whereas again, VCAS is really a great case because it really shows how there is much more of continuous visiting the identity, going from a lender to a credit reporting agency, to a credit note.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm thinking that this idea of the narrative as a kind of sense-making device and something that needs to both, consider legitimacy and updating. It ties into both this optimal distinctiveness, but also this notion of a creation heritage that Pascal was talking about the other day, that you operate within kind of and stretch in various ways. So I think that's definitely something that's coming through in many of the talks and presentations.
Yeah, so there was a question about the VCAS. So the VCAS case,
really?
the Huang et al. Was published in MIS Quarterly in 2017. My understanding is that those same authors actually have a follow-up story, but again, since we are studying the Nascent, we really focused on the published case.
Okay. Any other comments, reflections, Frido?
Sorry, it's just I was just typing there.
Yeah.
No, I think that narratives are sort of, if I understand it well, they bring the dynamics. And if you have the narratives in order to make sense of what's happening or where the situation you're in, basically you're setting the scene for moving forward by framing the potential future, which is still a conceptual idea. And if you look at that through the eyes of design literature, then you see design.
Yes, and again, our point is that again, if we look at, for example, these iterative, and so the iterative needs to, the team needs to think about, okay, what are the acceptation, how to go a little bit, beyond just the immediate work, for new possibilities. So we just created this artifact. Take a few moments to think about new opportunities it's creating. This kind of goes back to some of the Henrik's work, and then think about this narrative. If they are if the team is doing a lot of acceptation, a lot of trial and error, kind of blue sky, then there need to be some moments really reflecting on the, again, like how we would actually produce this, and what would be the long-term implications on the technical infrastructure that we have. So again, the VCAS case is great because it kind of talks about, again, how the company kept building on these internal technical capabilities. Of course, that also kind of comes to the Yahoo and the Google story that Violina wrote.
No, I would refer to that as a design narrative. Very much. I mean, iterations are, if you plan an experiment, then you plan for an upcoming iteration, right? You do a step ahead, and then you might look what's happening, and then you go back and you reflect on what's happening, and you make a next step. And iteration that is unwanted comes too late in the process. But that's the unwanted iteration, so very costly, by the way.
Yeah, so I think Kathleen had a question about how narratives can be used and if there are normative implications. You want to formulate that?
Sure. Yeah, I was first of all, thanks for an interesting talk, and way better skill with your PowerPoint. But I was interested in in narratives, and does every entrepreneur have a narrative? And do narratives actually make a difference from a normative point of view?
Yeah, we think that again, you know, narratives very much are reflecting kind of the schema, and of course, Raghu is who has written a lot about narratives. But here we are really kind of, you know, perhaps taking a fairly operational view, because we are talking about the technology, you know, development and how the technology development stays as kind of the engine of the business. I mean, at least the entrepreneurs that I have worked, they get stuck in their narratives, and in many cases because they are not rethinking about their technology beliefs, and then again, you know, in many of the software related industries, you know, and it's reflecting in academic literature, there's too much focus on the scaling that you just need to scale. I think again, Kathleen, your work on slow time, I think
Yes.
really speaks.
Yeah, certainly that was what
yes.
that was in our comparison of the business models. The firms that ended up, they started off really fast and then they faded because they just focused on growth, and at the end of the day, they were never profitable.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's like the slow food time.
There you go.
So Raghu, you want to jump in here on the narrative stories?
Well, I just wanted to share my thoughts on very interesting presentations, both by Kathy and then Sirkka right now. Sirkka, your point about virtuous and vicious circles and narratives and discourse, I just thought I'll just share my thoughts very briefly. And clearly, you know, the stories and narratives are based upon the cultural constructs in circulation in the discourse. And so that's the intertextuality which happens. And so we actually use that to study Silicon Alley, which is in Manhattan. And the .com was evoked and Webvan was evoked actually in our conversation. And what we found was that all these companies were using their stories, you know, based upon what was emerging, the technologies emerging, the beliefs about them. And so that created a kind of a virtuous circle initially. And so you had this kind of a burst of .com companies which are emerging, but then it overreaches. And all these constructs and labels which are very valuable suddenly become worthless. And in fact, they start losing legitimacy. And it then turns into a vicious circle. So there's a kind of a connection between, first and foremost, dyadically between various ventures who are using each other's narratives to build upon each other's work, and then creating this field, but then it overshoots and then it collapses. And then people start abandoning those constructs and labels which have lost currency. I just thought I'd just share that story with you. That's a multi-level process leading to vicious and virtuous circles.